Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's keep week 40 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, for this whole series, we've been getting to know Tolkien's circle of literary friends, the Inklings, a bit better, mostly C.S. Lewis. And we've been using Humphrey Carpenter's excellent book to help us. Last time we looked at the Great War between C.S. Lewis and Owen Barfield before going for a stroll on Addison's Walk. Now, today we'll look more at Tolkien's explanation about the truth of myth, and we're going to go back and forth between Carpenter's book and Tolkien's poem, Mythopoeia. Now, first, to put us back where we were, Lewis had expressed his belief that even though these myths were beautiful and moving, they were, in Lewis's words, lies, and therefore worthless, even though breathed through silver. Tolkien disagreed and proceeded to argue, and here I quote Carpenter. "You look at trees," he said, "and call them trees, and probably you do not think twice about the word. You call a star, and think nothing more of it. But you must remember that these words, tree, star, were, in their original forms, names given to these objects by people with very different views from yours. To you, a tree is simply a vegetable organism, and a star simply a ball of inanimate matter moving along a mathematical course. But the first men to talk of trees and stars saw things very differently. To them, Tolkien said, the world was alive with mythological beings. They saw the stars as living silver bursting into flame in answer to the eternal music. They saw the sky as a jeweled tent, and the earth as the womb whence all living things have come. To them, the whole of creation was myth-woven and elf-patterned." Now, if you've read Tolkien's Mythopoeia, this argument is going to sound incredibly familiar, and I'm going to read from that poem. "You look at trees and label them just so, for trees are trees, and growing is to grow. You walk the earth and tread with solemn pace one of the many minor globes of space. A star's a star, some matter in a ball, compelled to courses mathematical, amid the regimented, cold, inane, where destined atoms are each moment slain." Later he writes, "Yet trees are not trees until so named and seen, and never were so named till those had been, whose speech's involuted breath unfurled." And then along the same lines, talking about the stars again, "He sees no stars who does not see them first, of living silver made, that sudden burst to flame like flowers beneath an ancient song, whose very echo after music long has since pursued. There is no firmament, only a void, unless a jeweled tent, myth-woven and elf-patterned, and no earth, unless the mother's womb, whence all have birth." Now, back to Carpenter, who explains that this was not a new notion to Lewis, for Tolkien was, in his own manner, expressing what Barfield had said in poetic diction. Nor, said Lewis, did it effectively answer his point that myths are lies. "But," replied Tolkien, "man is not ultimately a liar. He may pervert his thoughts into lies, but he comes from God, and it is from God that he draws his ultimate ideals." And again, that leads us right back to this from Tolkien's Mythopoeia. "The heart of man is not compound of lies, but draws some wisdom from the only wise, and still recalls him. Though now long estranged, man is not wholly lost, nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned. His world dominion by creative act, not his to worship the great artifact, man, sub-creator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Though all the crannies of the world we filled with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods and their houses out of dark and light, and sow the seed of dragons, 'twas our right, used or misused. The right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we're made." And now I'm going to go back to Carpenter. Lewis agreed. He had indeed accepted something like this notion for many years. Therefore, Tolkien continued, not merely the abstract thoughts of man, but also his imaginative inventions must originate with God, and must, in consequence, reflect something of eternal truth. In making a myth, in practicing mythopoeia, and peopling the world with elves and dragons and goblins, a storyteller, or sub-creator, as Tolkien liked to call such a person, is actually fulfilling God's purpose and reflecting a splintered fragment of the true light. Pagan myths, Tolkien would argue, are therefore never just lies. There's always something of the truth in them. Now, this resonated with Lewis, but it still didn't fully convince him. Carpenter tells us that Tolkien explained his belief that pagan myths were, in fact, God expressing himself through the minds of poets and using the images of their mythopoeia to express fragments of his eternal truth. Well then, Christianity, Tolkien said, is exactly the same thing, with the enormous difference that the poet who invented it was God himself, and the images he used were real men and actual history. That was Tolkien's argument. As Lewis asked, though, is the story of the death and resurrection of Christ the old dying God story all over again, a story that's replete through mythology? Carpenter writes, "Yes," Tolkien answered, "except that here is a real dying God with a precise location in history and definite historical consequences. The old myth has become a fact," he says, "but it still retains the character of a myth." Now, Tolkien would continue, "Do we ask what the stories of Balder or other dying gods in pagan myths meant? No, we enjoy those stories," he argued. "We taste them and we get something from them more than a mere argument." And he suggested that Lewis could transfer that appreciation of story to the story of Christianity. And again, going back to Carpenter, could he not treat it as a story, be fully aware that he could draw nourishment from it which he could never find in a list of abstract truths? Could he not realize that it is a myth and make himself receptive to it? For Tolkien said, if God is mythopoeic, man must become mythopathic. That is, if God is a myth maker, we must understand the meanings of myths and sacred stories. And that definitely stuck with Lewis. And I'm going to wrap up with the conclusion to this chapter in Carpenter's book. It was now 3 a.m., and Tolkien had to go home. Lewis and Dyson came downstairs with him. They crossed the quadrangle and let him out by the little postern gate on Magdalen Bridge. Then, Lewis recorded, Dyson and I found more to say to one another, strolling up and down the cloister of New Building, so that we did not get to bed till 4. 12 days later, Lewis wrote to Arthur Greeves, "I have just passed on from believing in God to definitely believing in Christ, in Christianity. I will try to explain this another time. My long night talk with Dyson and Tolkien had a good deal to do with it." Now, folks, that wraps it up for this week's Tolkien Tuesday. Please join me again next week when we're actually going to fast forward a little bit to learn about Charles Williams and his friendship with Lewis and Tolkien. Now, despite Tolkien's personal beliefs, as well as those of Lewis, which shaped his entire writings from there forward, one of the things that I've observed about the Middle-earth legendarium in Tolkien's works is just how applicable it is for everyone, regardless of your belief, your faith system, or no belief at all. So I just want to encourage everybody, whether you share Tolkien's faith or not, or Lewis's faith, still, certainly plenty to enjoy in the Middle-earth legendarium. Now, please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, join my content council, get a bonus episode every week, and more. And join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps, and follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.